In today's episode, we chat with the CEO of KEASE International, Sarah Yip. She shares with us her experience throughout her career from being a uni student, taking a gap year, heading overseas, and coming back to start her own business, which she's been running now for a number of years, and her experience scaling that business and the learnings that she's had from some of the high-performing individuals she's had the pleasure of working with. Enough from me, let's get into it.
First of all, thanks so much for coming on, obviously. We've been wanting to do this for a few weeks now, right?
Yeah.
And I guess to kick things off, I'd really love for you to take not only myself, but the listeners through your career. And I guess from starting from back when you would have graduated high school to now. So first of all, where did you go to school?
I went to school at Marriotteville High School in Adelaide in South Australia.
Okay. And you obviously graduated there. Did you end up going to uni?
Yes, I did. I came to Brisbane and deliberately chose Brisbane because they were one of the few locations that ran a program called International Business at QT.
That's interesting. How did you find QT?
It was quite good. It was very different, right? So throughout high school, straight A student, and then you land at university and you realise, oh, everybody else here was a straight A student too, right? In order to get in. It's that leap from the pond to the ocean.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So at uni, the sort of student you were, it's sounding like you were quite a high achiever, or at least strive to be a high achiever. Would I be right in saying that?
Yeah, absolutely. So from high school onwards, I was already working. I started working when I was in grade 10. I was a waitress just on weekends. Okay. So a really strong work ethic, which was instilled in me by my parents, who were migrants from Hong Kong. And so a lot of this story of Asian Australians would be quite familiar with, is that you get brought up with a very strong work ethic and a strong message about why education is important, because it gives you choices in life. So from 15, I was waitressing. Throughout uni, I waitressed. And then in second year uni, I landed a role with the National Australia Bank as a senior service advisor.
Okay.
And so I was working full-time, doing full-time uni, and then on a Saturday night, I'd still be waitressing. So
wow. Yeah, so that work ethic was certainly there.
Definitely. And it all kind of worked out until year 3 of uni, and 365 days of running off a diet of coffee and sugar and working 2 jobs and full-time uni led me to crash and burn, basically.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so that was the beginning of third year at university.
Okay.
And then I ended up having to take a semester off and just reevaluate what I wanted to do with my life.
Wow. So it was a fatigue,
and so,
obviously. You were just...
Yeah, huge fatigue and a lot of unnecessary pressure that I was putting on myself. By the time I was 21, I was a branch manager at the National Australia Bank, one of the youngest ones around.
Okay.
And I own my own house, I own my own car. So all these milestones that you think success should look like, I was ticking them off and I was like, what's next? And then I realised, hey, it's not sustainable. And so I took a year off. I sold everything that I had and I took a year off and just went to Canada.
No way.
Yeah, so I often talk about pre-Canada and post-Canada, right? So pre-Canada, I had this mindset of what success should look like. And it was, the house, the car, the job, the outfit, the shoes. Oh, so many shoes, right?
Right.
And the handbags to match with it.
Can't forget those.
But I was really unfulfilled, Nick. I wasn't happy. I was miserable. I had all this stuff and I was really, really unhappy, deeply unhappy.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's really important you recognise that, right?
Absolutely. So I always say that I even peaked and was a high achiever and having my midlife crisis at the age of 22.
Oh, selling up everything that you'd worked the last few years for. I mean, yeah, it's sort of a quarter life crisis, isn't it, really, I guess?
Yeah. And then so I went to Canada for a year and I kind of looked around and asked myself, what is it that I really enjoy? I took up snowboarding and I snowboarded for 8 months while I was there. Wow. I lived on Vancouver Island, travelled throughout Europe, and then I came back. And what I landed on was that I really enjoyed making a difference to people. That was a really pivotal moment for me. So I sat on that and I let that percolate. And throughout that whole time that I was traveling, I was consuming so much information with regards to, work-life balance, looking for what you actually want, looking at the neuroscience, looking at emotional intelligence. So I was just an avid reader the entire time I traveled for a year and a half. And when I came back, always finish what you start. So I finished off my university degree. And while that was happening, it was percolating in the back of my mind, how do I now go about making my difference? So I landed on I wanted to make a difference.
Yeah.
How do I actually get there?
How exactly do you do it? So is there any insight you can give us to how you landed on that decision? Was there a light bulb moment on the trip or an experience maybe that you had that was that aha moment?
Absolutely. It was on a pebbled beach in Vancouver Island. And what I would do while I was living there was wake up in the morning, have breakfast, pop down to the library, take out a book, and then I'd sit on the beach and just read that book and then pop via the library and return it that afternoon.
Wow. So you read the entire book?
The entire book. So I'd read a whole book in a day, and I did that for the 60 days that I was there. So I read 60 books.
60 books in 60 days.
60 books in 60 days. And I can't tell you exactly what day it was, but I was on that beach and I was reading that book, and I realised that people spend 40 hours a week at work, and I had all of these bits of information that were really good for transforming your life personally. But then I came to this point where it just hit me, and I said, well, what if we took what could transform your life personally but presented it in the workplace to make you more effective? What would that do? What if we brought the two worlds together? Because the thing that I realised, and this is the reason why I burnt out, is that you don't have a work self and a home self, right? You are one self. You spend portions of your time in different locations with different people. But this very premise that we were sold that there is a work self and a personal self was a falsehood. And the longer that we believed in that falsehood, the more we would set ourselves up to fail. And so my mission was really to have this dialogue and bring this dialogue into workplaces, because that's where people spend most of their time, to actually say to them, there is no separation of self. You are one self, and all of those things overlap on each other. And if you're not handling the things in your personal life well, it's going to show up in work. And similarly, if you're not showing yourself up properly in work, it's going to show up as well in your personal life. And so that's what I embarked on in terms of a dialogue.
Wow. And it's so true. It's certainly thinking that we share at Grey Matter. There is no work-life balance. It's all life. Exactly. Further to what you just said just then, I totally agree. And before we delve into what's next, out of the 60 books that you read, is there one particular book, or is there 1, 2, or 3 particular books that really stood out to you that were really transformative in your thinking?
Absolutely. The very first would be When Everything Changes, Change Everything. And it was a really nondescript blue book. I picked it up simply because I like the colour of the cover. And then I said, oh, that's a really catchy title. Let's have a look at it. Yeah. And basically it was a man's journey who he had everything, and then he found himself homeless in the space of a year and a half.
Wow.
And what the book's premise is that when everything in your world changes, the first thing that you need to do is change your mindset and change the way you see things. So when everything changes, change everything. Change the way you think, change the way you behave, change the way you feel, and the way you engage with the world will change too. So that was a revolutionary book to read, because it wasn't, change this little part of you. It was asking you to make a radical change if you don't like the circumstance that you're in. And so I love that book, and I continue to love that book. The other one is A Road Less Travelled, an oldie but a goodie by Dr. Scott Peck. And that was a great book as well. Once again, it's a confronting read because it challenges these frameworks and mindsets that we have and that are brought to our attention. And when it does that, it's a confronting read. So there were several times as I read that book, and it wasn't an easy read. Because I was so confronted, I'd put it down and kind of go, why is it confronting me? What's it triggering within me? what am I holding on to that I shouldn't be holding on to? And then the last book, and I may get this wrong, but I think it had the word happiness in it, and it was by the Dalai Lama. And it was a wonderful read, that particular book. And once again, all three books were these confronting, challenging books to read, because if you allow yourself to absorb what is being written there, it allows for this self-reflection and questioning that assumes that you may not always be right. There was a book that I read much later on in my 30s that was called You're Not as Smart as You Think You Are. And the premise behind that book is that just because you think it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. So that we've all got these thoughts that we might have. And when we give value to those thoughts, we believe that those thoughts are correct. But if you never challenge those thoughts, how do you actually know that those thoughts are correct and actually work for you? So, yeah, so those three books would be my favourite during that period of time.
Wow. No, that's really interesting and timely, I suppose, at the moment, especially that first book that you mentioned, because of how much all of our worlds have radically changed in the last few months. The next step is, I guess, coming back from Canada, having a bit of a direction, but not really. I guess you had a destination without a vehicle, didn't you? I mean, what was next?
What was next was I needed to let the idea percolate a little bit more, because I looked around and I didn't feel that organisations were ready to hear this message yet. You've got to time these things, right? You've got to time your revolution.
Very true. That's a good point.
So I let the idea percolate a little bit, and I occupied my time. I went back to hospitality, and I worked for Accor, and I worked also as a wedding coordinator as well for a wedding destination on an island. And it was amazing during that period of time, because it allowed me to connect with people when things really matter. And I think that this is important later on in my career in terms of providing service to my clients, is having that user-centered approach. You know, today we talk about user-centered design and human-first or people-first principles. And I just think back to the days when I was a waitress or I worked in the hotel industry. People are always first, because the lifeblood of your industry relies on people. And often when I speak to young people these days and they say, oh, I want to have, this managerial position, or I want to aim for a CEO of this company, I ask them, have they done the hard yards and worked either in hospitality or retail? Because it's an amazing bedrock of skills when it comes to being service-focused and being of servitude to others. Absolutely. And that's an underlying principle of excellent leadership as well.
Because there's pieces to retail and hospitality, I imagine. My experience is more a bit in retail, but there's a humbling, I guess, for lack of a better word, when you're in those situations and when you're having those conversations where you are of service or in service to someone, I suppose. It is humbling, and it gives you a completely different perspective. And I don't want to walk past the point you made there with when you're talking to younger people and they're wanting to be a certain title and those sorts of things. And we can touch on that later about what your definition now of success is. Before we jump into that, we'll touch on that later on. There's so much coming out of this. It's really interesting. So you were in weddings?
I was in weddings, yeah. And often on a Saturday, we would have up to 6 weddings. And so you were dealing with 6 different brides. On one day.
And how did that go?
I learned a lot about negotiation, conflict resolution, crisis management during that period of time.
I can imagine.
Because it's high stakes. And managing expectations was really important during that role as well. And so I fondly remember that time. It's not inspired me to ever get married myself, mind you. But yeah, so I learned a lot during that time. Is something that I fondly remember, and I often reflect in moments later on in my career where I go, actually, I've learned this lesson before, and this is what I did then, and it actually worked. So I find myself borrowing from that time.
Yeah, especially the thinking on your feet and being adaptable, I feel, would have been 2 required strengths of a role like that.
Absolutely. And there were some great stories that came out of that as well.
Oh, really? Care to share any?
This is a whole other podcast in itself.
That's true. That's a good point.
Yeah.
We'll leave that for another podcast.
Absolutely. So 2 years I spent just connecting, percolating my ideas, sitting with it. And then I just thought to myself, you know what, I'm going to do it. I'm going to set myself up as a consultant and then work out what is it the message that I want to be sending and how does that look for people and where does it land. And where I found that it would land most was actually leaders, because I recognised the fact that with a lot of leaders, not only are you trying to do the work, but you're also trying to influence other people and at the same time balancing your own needs. And it's this challenging, tricky space to be in where you have multiple demands on your time and your resources, and it is high pressure. So what does one do with that? And realising then, I had a conversation with a mentor who was a limousine driver, but he was retired from the Asia Pacific General Manager of Johnson's & Johnson's, was his former title before retiring.
Wow.
And he bought himself a limousine license because he just missed chatting to people.
No.
Yes. And
Wow.
so he would drive me along and I'd just pick his brain and ask him lots of questions. And he said to me, Sarah, do you know how you turn a big cargo ship? How does a big cargo ship turn? And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, when you turn a big cargo ship, there's actually something within the propeller and it's this tiny little piece of equipment. And that's actually what turns this giant cargo ship. And I said, oh, okay. And he said, so when you're trying to make a massive move, stop focusing on the size of the cargo ship and focus on that tiny piece. Because if you land on that piece, the movement that you make will be bigger than the piece itself. And that was amazing wisdom to gain from somebody who had lived, right, and achieved so much.
Yeah.
And that stuck with me. And so my mind at the time, because while I was percolating all these ideas for 2 years, was that all I was focusing on was the cargo ship and how big the size of that it was, right?
You're right.
I was trying to cause a revolution. And then what this allowed me to do was free myself and go, stop looking at the cargo ship and instead focus on this tiny piece that allows you then to shift and cause the shift that you want it to do. And that was an amazing freeing experience. And I fondly, he's passed now, and I fondly remember those conversations with him because he didn't have to share his wisdom as he was driving me along, and he chose to. And I fondly remember those car trips. And I don't know that, many people can go, oh, yes, I really remember that limo drive.
Yeah.
But, I fondly remember those car trips.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that, because that's really, really valuable information for our listeners, and not only for them, for myself, actually. That's just such a great analogy. A couple of questions for you about going out on your own there, because you said it was time for you to start, or you were building your revolution. So the vehicle there was to become a consultant. So was there any hesitancy in wanting to start your own business?
No.
It just felt right?
No. So number one, no, because I come from a long line of entrepreneurs and small business owners, so that there was no fear in that whatsoever. And then secondly, I gave myself a timeline in order to be a solvent business. And so this is the difference between a paid hobby and actually having a business.
Okay.
So often people will take something that is their area of passion and they're very, very passionate about it, right? So just as I was passionate about human-centered leadership, they were passionate about whatever it is that caused them to start the business. But I think you do need to be practical at some point in time and put down some figures in and around that. And a paid hobby is something that just covers the bills and not much more. Yeah. And a business has a plan, has a vision, a structure, and part of that plan does involve some dollar figures in and around that. And often when I talk to now startups and entrepreneurs, because it's a common theme that pops up, I say to them that you need to know the difference between when you've got a paid hobby versus when you've got a fully fledged business. And you need to work out what those figures are. And if you get to the end of a certain period of time, for me it was 2 years, and you've not reached that, you then need to make some difficult decisions as to whether you continue, you reach out for capital, alternatively you make a different direction in your life. And that's that's really just hard and fast advice when it comes to running a business. And that's the advice that my parents gave me, basically, was you give yourself a time limit. Mine was 2 years. You're either solvent and up and running by then as a fully fledged business. Otherwise, you'll need to have a different plan. My backup plan was to return to full-time employment. And I knew that at that point in time. And within a year and a half, I was reaching my target of where I wanted to be. And then it's only ever grown since. So,
was there a period there of struggle? How was the first year?
Yeah, the first year was definitely, it was revisiting my uni diet all over again, wasn't it?
How much money did you spend on coffee in that first year?
That first year, yeah, it was just, and I think that's something that people need to recognise as well, because in a world of Instagram and influencers and TikTok and whatnot, it seems like success happens overnight. There is hard yards that you've got to put in. When you start a business, you're not working 40 hours a week. You are working 60, 80 hours a week at some points in time. You are making personal sacrifices, and you need to fully understand your why as to why you're doing it in order to make those sacrifices. But anyone who thinks, it's an overnight success, or people who read articles and go, $38 million is now what they're worth, you've got to bet your bottom dollar that they've put in $38 million worth of effort, time, blood and sweat and tears to make that happen, because it doesn't happen overnight.
Absolutely. And it's not everyone's cut out for it.
No. And I think that's really important for people to understand as well, because, when we look at the world of work at the moment, for a long time, there's been a shift towards a casualisation of the workforce and more people becoming consultants. And this is, and quite often I have people come to me and have a chat to me when they first start toying with the idea of being a consultant. Mm-hmm. And I say to them, there is some realities of what that looks like. And one of those things is not always having secure income. So from the outset, the industry that I'm in is typically quiet between December till February, and that's just the reality of it. And so I sought out some advice from real estate agents as to how they manage their money, because typically in real estate you have these booms and busts throughout the year, so you have cycles. So how do they manage those cycles? And I sought them out for some advice, and some really good advice they gave me at the time was always to have 6 months worth of ticking over money. So being able to have a business continuity plan that allowed for 6 months of lull was really good advice that I got. And they said, you may never use it, but knowing that it's there is amazingly freeing. Great advice that I got now 20 years ago that I'm, that helped see us through COVID essentially during the lockdown period. So, and that's something else as well, is that go and seek advice, not necessarily in your own industry, is a massive tip that I have for people.
It's a great point. Go and seek it out from areas you don't expect or you wouldn't have first expected, I guess.
That's one of the bits of advice that I give to people now, is that too often we are only asking for advice in our own echo chambers. And so you don't hear anything different.
That is so true. And then that's dangerous, because you don't know what you don't know.
Correct.
Very sound advice. That's really interesting. So the first year sounded like it started to take off by the sounds of it.
Correct, yeah. And what it was really seeking out the people who were already starting to toy with this idea. And the in that I had was in and around emotional intelligence. So, emotional intelligence was brought to the fore by Daniel Goleman in the early 90s. That didn't really start taking off in Australia and talking about emotional intelligence until, the mid-2000s. And that was my anchoring point as well, is to enter in through emotional intelligence, because we know that when we uplift the emotional intelligence quota ratings in leaders, you make a massive difference to productivity, staff engagement and staff retention. And when we speak to leaders now about whether they would like to make a positive difference in those three spaces, the answer usually is yes. Who doesn't want to increase productivity, staff engagement and staff retention? And so we say we've got a way of doing that. And that way of doing it is being able to uplift the capability in the space of leaders. And what happens is that the organisations see a win, right? Because that's their return on investment. And then for us, we see our win as well, because what we're actually delivering is beyond emotional intelligence. We're actually equipping them with a mindset of what it means to be a people-first leader. what does that look like in both, not just at work, but also in your home life too. So it's this quiet revolution that I've created, Nick. I started out idealistically at the age of 23 thinking it was going to be loud. And what I've been able to do is make the most amount of difference by operating quietly in the background with some fairly large organisations that have taken on these ideas that, if presented differently, would appear a bit woo-woo. But when you translate that into business metrics, it has massive impact.
Starts to make sense to them, yeah.
Correct.
And so before we delve a bit further into that, just for our listeners who don't know, just a little explanation of the business and how it is today, obviously, because we're talking about KEASE International here. So tell us a little bit about it.
So KEASE International, we work with a range of different industries. We've worked in elite sports, state government departments and ASX 200 listed companies. And our main goal is to be able to make a difference to business metrics through the empowerment of people, namely in emotional, social and adaptive intelligence. And we've been making a difference in this space for quite some time. And the context in which I've put it in is preparing people for the future of work, where the landscape is one of volatility, ambiguity, uncertainty, and complexity. And what's really interesting is that the world of work arrived on our doorsteps in February 2020. And so the things that we have been talking about and equipping our leaders with for the past 8 years, we were in good stead, because those leaders knew exactly what to do at that point in time, because they've been with us during that period. And one of the things that we've sought to do during this period of time is actually bring that message out to other people as well. So clients that haven't been with us during that whole journey of what that actually looks like. Because when the World Economic Forum highlights that the top 3 skills of the future of work are emotional intelligence, social intelligence, and adaptive intelligence, we really needed to listen 4 or 5 years ago, because it's those intelligences that we're leaning on right now.
Very interesting. So that was important for context about the business and what exactly it is that it's about. So a year and a half in, it's starting to look like, hey, this is gonna stick. We're gonna be around for a little bit here. What was the catalyst then to really go to that next level?
Basically, be brave.
Yep.
I made a list of all these different companies that I wanted to work with that I just saw, and some of those were companies that, as a 26-year-old now, that I was, my mum made a comment, geez, Sarah, you're really pushing it. Is anyone going to want to listen to you? And I turned around and I said to her, I don't know if I don't try. So I pulled out an Excel spreadsheet, Nick, and I made a list of 30 companies that I wanted to work with. And 10 of those are still with us today.
Wow.
And all I did was I called them and I said, look, this is something I'd like to be able to do. Do you have an hour to spare for me to show this to you? And some of those people said no, and that's perfectly fine. It wasn't the type of client. And that's really big as well, is that we never try and convince a client.
Okay.
So yeah, that's really important to me. So we don't try and convince clients that they should work with us. We know what works, and often that's enticing enough in its own right. And right up until 2 years ago, we had no website, because we built our entire business on word of mouth of people who have been able to see the measurable difference and then shared it with others as well. So number 1 was be brave, go and ask.
Yeah, and I guess an extension to that, go and ask, is I wanted to sort of extract from you a bit more about how you got the seat at the table there. Was it literally cold calling?
I literally just made my Excel spreadsheet and then I worked out what the phone number was to call them and then asked to speak to the HR department, spoke to the person in the HR department, explained what I was thinking of doing and asked them whether they'd have time for a coffee for me to talk to them a little bit further about it. And that was it. There was no strategic plan. There was no, masterful idea behind it. It literally was pick up the phone and make a phone call. And I think this is what people forget, right, is how honest, genuine connection, how valuable that is. And I wasn't there to try and, I don't know, I wasn't there with any hidden agenda at all. I was really clear with my agenda was, which is I wanted to be able to make a difference in their organisation. And that was it, really. So
tying it back to what we were talking about before, that exact way of thinking, that's potentially part of the reason why some people cannot cut it when they're in this field or in their particular business and that sort of thing, is they aren't willing to do what you did just there, which is literally go, well, this is who I want to work with, and I'm just going to get my foot in the door. I'm going to do the hard yards, as you said.
Absolutely. I mean, yesterday I came across an image in a group that I'm a part of, and it was a man standing by the side of the road with a cardboard sign seeking employment with his phone number on it. And I reposted that post. And the question that I had was, would you be brave enough to be this vulnerable? Because you need to have courage to be vulnerable, and you need to be able to be vulnerable. You're putting yourself into a position of vulnerability when you're going out and cold calling and you're asking for a moment of somebody else's time, because that vulnerability and the very real reality is that they turn around and they say no, right? And I guess what it is that you just need to tap into your courage and your purpose and know what you're doing is valuable and put yourself out there. And I actually reached out to the person because he had his mobile number on there, and I made sure I sent him a text message of encouragement to say to him, you know, good on you for being brave, and good on you for showing up and being vulnerable enough to ask for help. And, you know, because there's so many other people who don't. They sit at home and expect something to be given to them. And I said to him, keep being awesome and just keep going. And I say this to startups as well. I say it to anybody to entrepreneur journey or intrapreneur journey. If you've got a message to sell, and if you've got, you know, something to give to other people, you've got to not be afraid enough to do the hard yards, pick up the phone, make a genuine connection, or stand on the corner and actually say, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm offering.
Wow, that's such good advice, I think, for a lot of people out there, especially during this time. Obviously, there's so much disruption to the workforce. There's lots of people that maybe were consultants, let's just pick on that for a second, that were consultants and are now having to re-enter the workforce, or they're in this limbo of, do I continue to try and make a fist of this, or do I go back and, you know, try and get a full-time job as my backup plan? You know, it's really important advice, and hopefully it's timely for some of our listeners out there to hear exactly what you just said. It's really important. It's really cool. Thank you. Now, with KEASE International and where it is now, I want to quickly talk about how you got through COVID and how that time affected your business.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a lot of work booked in for the year. In fact, we were booked out until November. And then I think it was the first week of March, I reached out to my clients and I said, okay, so what is this looking like now? And because in the way that we work with our clients, we're very honest. We become part of their organisation, and you know, they come to me for advice, and one of the things that I've always given them is to make sure that even if there's no work for us out of it, that I make sure that they have the best advice possible that comes from me. And often they said, oh, Sarah, that means that, you know, you're actually not getting work out of this. And I said, that's completely fine, because I should rather maintain that relationship. And I think we were rewarded for that in that first week of March, because they came to us with their truth and where they were sitting at, and where they were going to be for this year ahead. And some of them honestly said, look, at the moment, I don't know. Can we please postpone, and we'll move it to the end of the year? I have to say that that relationship also extended itself out financially as well. So there was one organisation in particular who said to me, we will honour the payment schedule and just have you deliver later.
Wow.
Now, Nick, for so long I've spoken about kindness and caring, because the K in KEASE stands for kindness, and that is the principle in which we operate our business. And here they were practicing that same kindness back to my small business. And I said to them, this will keep us afloat. Your very decision to honour the pay schedule will help keep us afloat, and not just us, but our entire team. And not only did it do that, it actually helped our team grow. So that was just amazing.
Wow, how kind. That's an incredible gesture.
And I think we skip out on that when we talk about business, don't we? Is that kindness is not often the first word that people think about when they talk about business.
No, that's so true.
So that's what the K stands for us. And we made sure then we demonstrated that and extended that kindness out. And what we actually used that money for was we created something called Leaders Lounge, a space where leaders could come and engage, where clients or non-clients could come and engage and ask questions of our coaching associates, so all of our leadership experts that we have on board as part of our team.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a safe place to ask questions. And it was amazing, Nick, because you had these people who would come in that they were overwhelmed themselves as leaders, suddenly found themselves isolated because they were working remotely, challenged because they had never managed remote teams before, tapped out because they had demands from family and children and staff members who were overwhelmed themselves. And there was nowhere for them to go and feel safe and to express what they were feeling. And so that's what we created when we created the Leaders Lounge. Weekly, every Friday, they could dial in, they could pre-pose questions to us, and our associates would be there to provide free group coaching. So the act of kindness from one of my clients propelled and created this kindness that was a bit of a ripple effect out to Australian businesses. And we had leaders dialing in, not just from Australia. So we've had leaders dialing in from Dubai, from England, from America. Wow. And they said there's nothing else like this at the moment. And what it wasn't just another webinar, which was because we were all flooded with so many webinars. What it was interaction, it was connection, and it was kindness. And that was very much the principles behind Leaders Lounge. It's become so popular that we've actually been able to change the offering of what we do as well. So traditionally, KEASE International has worked with other organisations, so it's a B2B business. Mm-hmm. And under the branding of Leaders Lounge, we are now a B2C business, so talking directly to the leaders. And we've been able to put in a whole host of services that are being launched in September, which is basically, coaching services for leaders. And that's all come out of COVID. And I have to say, my associates are absolutely remarkable. The team, they just bedded down. We came together. We were there to support each other, uplift each other, and provide each other with coaching. So we've got all these brilliant coaching skills.
Yeah.
And we would organise one-on-one coachings between themselves and each other, and they would coach each other. And it was amazing to see and so beautiful to stand back and reflect on. And something else that we made sure that we did was to have a space to just chat and to release really random conversations. If we were having a bad day, popping it up there, or things that go drastically wrong, and popping it up there and just uplifting each other.
Yeah, and which is a thing that we've noticed in the organisations we're working with at the moment is, especially if you've got teams that are working remotely now, it's when we're all missing out on that incidental water cooler chat, right? It's the conversations that we have when we're walking past someone and it's, tap you on the shoulder, just quickly while we're here, blah, blah, blah. It's all these conversations that we're missing out on because we're not together. And there's no way, unless you really work hard on forcing those, whether they're, some organizations have done like a 10-minute scrum meeting every morning. Some organizations do it every single morning, or some teams. But, once a week, unless you're forcing those conversations, they won't happen. And so you're missing out on a key piece of what a work environment provides to you. So it's cool that you've recognized that, and you're putting in you're creating it, you're making it happen. That's really cool.
Yeah, and some of the things that popped up, it would be, maybe a random meme, or it's just, it's completely non-work related chatter. And you're right, it's that sense of connection. And we know that that's a critical element when it comes to resilience. So when we talk about, building people's resiliency skills, it's one of the core elements is being able to tap into your social network. And now you can't actually be with your social network and be in that space, it is absolutely critical that we create ways of being able to do that.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm reminded of is that there's this great book called Reality is Broken, and it's written by Jane McGonigal. And Jane's premise in The Reality is Broken is that we often demonize things such as gaming and tech and refer to it as a way that disconnects and disassociates. And in her book, she actually explores how you can actually use gaming and online to connect. And I've read that book probably 3-4 years ago. And it really stuck with me is that connection, whilst it's different, it's still connection. And it's allowing people to understand that. So it's a different way of seeking out that connection.
That's so interesting. Yeah. It's different, isn't it? But it's
different.
It still is a way of forging those connections.
Yeah, correct. And I also have to say, right, observing, so I've got 2 children with high functioning autism, right? And so their social connections and the way they socially connect with people is different to what we call neurotypicals, NTs. And so they have a different way of socially connecting. And my conversations with people on the autism spectrum is we're right in our element right now. Like, COVID has allowed us to do some of our things that used to be considered strange and weird, such as connecting online, as the new norm. So it's this, it's this different dialogue, And they actually said that they feel more included than ever, because previously that sense of physical being in a meeting, a setup and framework was actually excluding them because that's not where their strengths were in terms of a way to connect. And now that we're connecting more online or in a different way, it actually allows them to feel more included than ever. It was a really interesting conversation to have as a side note of how we look at inclusion and diversity.
That is so fascinating, and it does make perfect sense.
Yeah.
Really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. So tying this back into KEASE, where to next? I mean, you've taken us through that you're going to be serving up a whole suite of new offerings in September, but what's next? What does the next year look like living with the pandemic that we're all in? What's next?
Yeah, so what we've done is that we continue to work with our organisations, and we're picking up where we left off in March. So a lot of those services are resuming. But what we've actually found is that we've gained more interest in our services because we've had that gift of the Leaders Lounge. So more and more people are interested in what we do and how we go about doing it. So 2021 looks like it will be a really, really good year, and an expansion of services and being able to bring in more associates as well. So we're back on track, essentially, of what we do. And one of the big things that we speak about quite often is about being agile and being able to be responsive in that agile manner and being able to be adaptive. And years we've been talking about the future of work has arrived. And so we're able to actually say, continue to do what we're doing. You know, we know that it works, and it works for the companies that we've been working with.
Excellent. Oh, that's great. That's really, really good to hear that 2021 looks like it's going to be a good year for you guys. That's really good to hear. Tying it back to you now, I guess I wanted to move back towards you, Sarah. There's a lot of emphasis put on succeeding in today's world. And like you said, you know, the Instagram, we live in this time where there's a lot of emphasis put on appearances and looking like you're succeeding. But deep down for you, what does success really look like for you?
I want to be able to say on my deathbed that I made a difference to people, a positive impact to others. I want to say that I didn't choose work over family and friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say that my legacy will be bigger than I ever was. So that, to me, is success. I started out in this idea of consultancy because I wanted to be able to be for my children, and I've been able to do that. And to not have to juggle or compromise in any way. And it has allowed me, time and time again, I'll get feedback to say, when you said this during a presentation, that's made a massive difference in my life. I remember delivering years ago a topic on inbox zero, and then 3 years down the track, I bumped into this lady at a shopping centre and she said, "Oh, do you remember me?" And I said, genuinely, I'm sorry, I don't. Because I meet a lot of people.
Yeah.
And she said, "Oh, I attended your topic on Inbox Zero and managing your emails effectively and saving time." She says, "I still do it to this day. And every time I see that my inbox has got zero emails in it, I just think of you." And it's just made such a difference to me. And
Wow.
I felt so terrible that I couldn't remember her in that moment at the shopping centre because I was so meaningful for her. That to me brings me such joy, Nick. It really does, because that's all I'm here for, is if I made a small positive difference in somebody else's life, it means more to me than anything, because I know that that's my purpose.
What an excellent answer. And look, to be honest, I think that's the perfect way to wrap up this episode. That was such a genuine, open and honest answer. So I want to thank you for your honesty in all of this and all the many insights that you've provided. And I think there's definitely a few or a couple more episodes at least that I can think of topics that we can really dive into here, share a little bit more, especially around leadership as well is one that I'd love to do. But also a little bit, even diving into a little bit more about your insane work ethic and how you manage it all. So thank you so much for coming on, Sarah. And I really appreciate you giving up this hour we've been on also that we've been on the podcast. Thank you so much.
My absolute pleasure, Nick, and thank you for inviting me.